Second half of the Reconstruction chapter. I am going to be talking about the redeemers or the redemption of the South. And the question is, after 650,000 dead and a war that tore apart the country, how the heck did everything end up almost exactly as before the war within 10 years after the end of the war? How come nothing changed? And the South is responsible for that. The North is responsible for that. They are both responsible. Going down now to slide number 6 on there. If you look at slide number 2, it's a political cartoon, and this is the Southern view of Reconstruction, that the Northern carpetbaggers, and the man in the carpet bag looks like U.S. Grant to me, is coming down with the help of military troops to crush the poor South, who is hovering underneath there. If you want to look at the Northern view of Reconstruction, they are sending down people to help defend African Americans who are now free from the rabble, from Southern white rabble. So very different views of Reconstruction depending on who writes the book. And this has continued almost to the present. So trying to balance the views is a little bit difficult here. The portrait in slide number 3 is Andrew Johnson, by the way. And we're now working with the 6th slide, the text with it. The question is, how did things end up the same? Why did nothing change? There's a number of factors here. I'm dividing it into economic, political, and social factors that conspired to change situation after the war back to exactly what it was before the war. First of all, economically, the South becomes and stays what we would call today a colony of the North. What is a colony? It is like colonial Africa or Asia, a territory that belongs to another person, that is subordinate or basically dominated by another place. And the South stayed more or less a colony of the North. It remained agricultural. It kept its large percentage of very poor population, black and white. No immigrants went to the South. They did not want to be there before the war with slaves. They did not want to be there after the war. They were not encouraged to come. Industry was not encouraged. Who was going to invest in the South to build factories in 1865? Not too many Northerners or Europeans. As a result, into the 20th century, 98% of Southerners, until recently, were native-born Americans. Almost no immigrants went to the South. The South, in 1875, 22% of the U.S. population owns 16% of the assets, in other words, factories, machinery, profitable items, produces 10% of the industry of the country with 22% of the population, and has an average income half that of the North. The South stayed poor really until after the Second World War. Things did not change a whole lot. Example, an Iowa farmer in 1875 could produce $1,100 worth of crops. South Carolina farmer, on actually much better land, produced $160 worth of crops. Now, some of the soil in the South is worn out because of the type of crops they grow. A lot of it was just inefficient management. Texas, which was a cotton-producing state and a timber-producing state from East Texas. Texas exported cotton and timber and imported paper and cloth made from cotton and timber. Why? There was no factories to turn the timber into paper or lumber. There were no factories to turn the cotton into cloth. It was shipped to the North, and the North made more profit on it. There was also not a very good transportation system for a long time in the South. There wasn't before the war. This continued for a good long time. The textbook talks about the building of railroads. There were railroads built in the South. A lot of them lost money. A lot of them were boondoggles and went bust and stopped running too. If you are still growing the same crops, largely cotton, some tobacco, some rice in Carolina and Louisiana. All of these crops need a lot of labor, a lot of unskilled manual labor. Where was the labor going to come from? The ex-slaves. The other place it came from was what we call today convict leasing, who were literally called slaves of the state. If one of the punishments for vagrancy or for not being able to produce a contract for a job, excuse me, was not sneezing, but was to go to prison unless you could make bail. And what ex-slave had enough money to make bail? And if you couldn't make bail, you were put to work, big surprise, on government-owned and run sugar and cotton farms. Sugarland, Texas, was originally a prison farm. This is literally slave labor, often in chain gangs. You were sent to prison sometimes starting at age 8. They were sending kids in some of these places. A theft, and in some cases there are on the books punishment for theft of an orange or theft of an apple, was 2 to 3 years. In one case in Texas, a young child, 11 or 12 years old, got a 7-year sentence for stealing an orange. The average lifespan in prisons was about 7 years. Most people did not get out. Imperial sugar, which we see on the shelves today, was largely produced by prison sugar plantations in Georgia, South Carolina, and Louisiana. The white convicts, we also had white prisoners, they worked inside in simple manufacturing. Today they make license plates, that kind of stuff. Black convicts worked outside in the fields. How else does this become a system? At the end of the war, ex-slaves are freed and they own absolutely nothing. So how do you feed your family? How do you keep from starving to death? What's the skill set of ex-slaves? Agricultural labor, unskilled agricultural labor. Who has the land? Their former owners, large plantation owners. So they have to hire out their labor to the landowner. How do they pay? How does the landowner pay? He splits the crop. You had to pay rent for the land you were working, and it was called sharecropping. The going rate was about 50%, pretty much. You also, in your sharecropping contract, had to provide maintenance labor like building fences. You had to rent your livestock because, again, ex-slaves own no livestock. You had to rent a mule or ox to plow the field. You had to rent your plow and your equipment. You had to borrow money or get the seed from the owner, all of which you owned the owner for. Now, this is not only ex-slaves. This is also many, many, many millions of poor whites in the South as well, who were left at the end of the war with nothing, with no assets. So slave cropping became the economic system of the South. Slavery turned into sharecropping. And if you look at sharecropping contracts, unfortunately, I've got a bunch in my folder and we can't pass around the folder. If you look at the terms of sharecropping contracts, they're almost exactly like slavery. They couldn't leave the plantation, their employer's plantation, without a written pass. They could only buy their supplies from a local store. Guess who owned the local store? Large plantation owner. You can imagine what the prices were in that store. Slaves were largely illiterate at the end of the war. Who's keeping the books? The plantation owner, et cetera, et cetera. You can see what's going on here. Your kid gets sick. You have no money. What do? You go to your employer. Can I borrow some money to take the kid to the doctor? You need legal help. Can I borrow some money to hire a lawyer? Anything you needed, you pretty much had to go to your employer and borrow money against next year's crop. You have a good year, 50% of the crop does not sound bad, and they did okay. Bad year, as we know in Texas, not every year has good weather. If there's a drought, if there's flood, if the crop fails, an early hailstorm, then what do? You have to go to the landowner and borrow money against the following year's crop. So some people did okay. The majority over time fell into debt. Once you're in debt, you never get out of debt. And illegal today, but not then, debts were inherited by your children. They did not wipe away the debt at your own death. Your children inherited it. So this is in a form, really a form of legal slavery. Slavery became economically sharecropping for decades and decades. The situation does not change in the South. There is still a need for a lot of unskilled manual labor with crops until after the Second World War, when we finally get a mechanical cotton picker. And that's not until the late 1940s. So for 75 years, you need a lot of destitute, poor labor. And those were sharecroppers, black and white. Largely black, but a good number of poor whites as well. Okay? Socially, how do the smaller percentage of wealthy white Southerners at the end of the war, because they still own their land, even if they own nothing else, how do they recreate the conditions of slavery? Immediately after the war, localities and states, not nationally, but local and state, passed black codes. These were essentially slave laws. Not called that, but they were called black codes, particularly for ex-slaves, but again, also for many, many poor whites. In most southern states, including Texas, intermarriage between the races was a felony offense. An African American could only be a witness for another African American. He could never testify in court against a white person. All kinds of restrictions, pretty much the same restrictions as in slavery. No ownership of guns was often one of them. Many times they were barred from buying and selling land, for example, but pretty much the same restrictions. Instead of slavery, they called it black codes. What happens, of course, is northern lifespan becomes very quickly twice that of South, black and white. In the rural South, into the 1900s, the average lifespan was 33 years. Taxes. The political system, our state government, our local government is responsible for two things: infrastructure and education on all levels, colleges down through elementary school. Okay, so when we pay taxes, we are supporting local education and infrastructure. We're paying taxes to the state, and they do the infrastructure and the schools. Okay, South historically has had very low taxes, still does today. The taxes in Texas today are property taxes are 25% below the national average of property taxes. If you are paying low taxes, that means you don't have that much money, and that means your education system is not going to have enough money to operate well. And historically, up until very recently, Southern public schools were much inferior to public schools in the North, with a lot of exceptions, but this is as a general rule. Okay, the salary, not the salary, but the money allocated per child by the state in most southern states was half of what northern states allocated. For a white child in a southern public school, the state, this is across the board, would allocate $250. For a black child in a southern public school, the state allocated $20. That's a problem right there. Okay, so socially, segregation replaced slavery with the black codes. There was separation of the races. They were not allowed access to a lot of things, and the whole education system was definitely not equal. Politically is the most important part. What happens? The probably 5% of the wealthiest Southerners, former large plantation owners, usually controlled the South before and after the war. There are attempts to have African Americans voting, and Very quickly after the war, they stopped voting. I want to talk about this in our session, which will probably be tomorrow. But particularly anything dealing with the Freedmen's Bureau was targeted. If you look at the last couple of slides there, you will see in slides 7 through 11, you will see a KKK rally. You will see a chart of the known number of people lynched state by state. These are known cases. We have records, public records in the South of about 5,000 public lynchings, which were usually held in the town square and were considered a major entertainment event in many small towns in the South. That's the known cases. The assumption is, and we have a good deal of evidence, a lot of people just disappeared and nobody knows what happened to them. The estimate now is probably about 50,000 were lynched or executed, oftentimes trying to vote. Whites, particularly carpetbaggers who tried to support Black voting rights, were also often killed. There is a case in Jefferson, Texas, of a white man named George Washington Smith, ironically enough, and he gave a speech to a political Republican meeting. Now, Republicans were a few white people and usually freed slaves. During the speech, 4 men shot at him. Smith, who had a pistol, shot back. He hit 2 of them. Smith was jailed on assault charges, not the other 4. While he was in jail, he was shot dead through the jail cell window. Nobody was ever convicted. Nobody was ever tried for this crime. In the nearby town of Marshall, Texas, a white man who stood up for African American rights was dragged out and killed publicly in the street. So not only African Americans, a lot of those, but also whites who stood up for them, which became fewer and fewer. So I want to finish talking about that later, but the end of Reconstruction, what happened with Reconstruction, what failed? Number 1, what we call today donor fatigue. People got tired of the issue. A good example I use is if you remember Haiti or even Puerto Rico 2 years ago, the devastation that happened in Puerto Rico. Have you heard about that in the news lately? Not at all. That's 2 years ago. Everybody was concerned. Everybody gave money. Everybody helped Puerto Rico. We don't hear about it anymore. Same thing happened to Northerners. We've heard about this issue. We hear about this issue. There's problems. I'm tired of it. I gave it the office. In 1873, there was an economic downturn, a recession, and the focus shifted from the condition of ex-slaves and what was happening in the South to the recession and economic problems. The South refused to play along. By 1872, there were a grand total of 300 ex-Confederates who could not hold office. They were voting, but could not hold government office, federal offices. Southern states signed on and endorsed what they called the Mississippi Plan, and I'm quoting from it. This was not a rule, but a document that Southern states passed in Southern legislatures. I'm quoting from it. All other means having been tried to change the horrible conditions of things, the thieves and robbers and scoundrels, black and white, in Reconstruction, deserve death and ought to be killed. Carry the election peacefully if we can, forcibly if we must. So the 1876 election is coming up, and that's the Southern attitude towards it. What happened in the 1876 election is basically the North sold out. They abandoned the South. If they had stayed, if the military had stayed, if they had kept pushing, maybe things could have been different. So the South isn't going to change voluntarily, and the North gave up and let them alone. So Democratic candidate Tilden, remember Confederates are now voting again. They are back in Congress. Tilden had more popular votes, but the votes of 3 states Louisiana, Mississippi, I think South Carolina, I know Louisiana was one, had not come in. So Congressional Electoral College voters, remember, we don't elect presidents by popular vote, otherwise Tilden would have been president, but it's settled in the Electoral College, and those votes were still coming in. They were a little late. So this whole voting thing has long antecedents in American history. Republicans went to Democratic Party operatives and said, see if you can get those votes come in for Republican Hayes, and make sure that you switch one of your electoral votes from Tilden, who is Democrat, to Hayes. Now, there's not a whole lot of difference between the candidates, Democratic and Republican Party. Pretty much they had the same economic plans. They were very similar. It's just who gets the goodies at the end of the election. So the electoral votes came in. Big surprise. Hayes had a single vote majority in the Electoral College. What did the South get for switching their votes, their Electoral College votes, to Hayes? The deal was the federal troops would be withdrawn from the South, which they were shortly after the 76 election. There would be federal money to help complete a railroad across the South. If you want to see the route of that railroad today, it's I-10. Railroad runs along most of it. There were some Southerners appointed to the president's cabinet, to Hayes' cabinet. This whole Electoral College thing was not settled until 2 days before inauguration. So for 3 months, we didn't know who the president was. Does any of this sound familiar? I'm sorry, here I've got the states. Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina sent in 2 sets of voting results, and the Electoral College made the decision. At this point, it is a solid South for 100 years. The South votes Democratic almost overwhelmingly, not completely, but overwhelmingly, and the expression was, these are yellow dog Democrats. Quoting, a dead dog could get elected if he ran on the Democratic Party ticket. So that's yellow dog Democrats. The final nail in the coffin are the 2 Supreme Court decisions right before 1900. Remember that in the 14th Amendment applied only to government positions, government agencies, and not private businesses, even if they happen to own public areas or run public areas. The Supreme Court in the 1880s said that segregation was perfectly fine in private clubs, private businesses, just not public government spaces, like, for example, Congress. Okay, this is until recently. Up until very recently, and still today, there's some issues with it. There were famous Supreme Court cases within the last 20 years about golf clubs that only allowed whites to play at that course because they're private. They were not publicly owned. If they were publicly owned, it would be a different thing. The 2 key cases are Plessy versus Ferguson, which is 1896, and 1899, Cummings versus Board of Education. Homer Plessy was a very light-complexioned, mixed-race man who was 7/8 white, who looked white, but he got on a local railway train, railway car, passenger car. Everybody in the area knew him. He was immediately taken off the railway car so he could ride in the African American, the black car, not the white car, because he got on in the white car. Remember, there's total segregation. Okay? He takes the case to the Supreme Court with a very good lawyer. And the Supreme Court rules, which just shows you the Supreme Court is not right all the time, that separate but equal is legal under the U.S. Constitution. As long as the facilities, the railway cars, were equal, they could be legally segregated. Okay, this is later applied to schools and all kinds of other public buildings. 1899, it gets worse. Cummings versus Board of Education. Cummings was a poor black family whose child was sent to a separate, very unequal African American school. We talked about the ratios earlier. They were getting 10% of the money that white schools were getting. So this is clearly not separate but equal, and they sued. Schools should have equal funding. Cummings versus Board of Education, 1899, the Supreme Court ruled that separate and unequal are perfectly constitutional. So not only separate but equal, but separate but unequal are also legal under the U.S. Constitution. These laws stayed in effect for about another, 65 years, really, okay? Until Brown versus Board of Education, and Brown wasn't even enforced immediately after it was passed in 1955. So politically, economically, socially, the South returns to what it was before the Civil War. Things do not change for another 75, 80 years. And I don't spend much time after this for a long time talking about the South because nothing changed. And the real tragedy of the Civil War, 650,000 dead, nothing changed for close to a century. That's the American tragedy, and that's the roots of what is going on today as well. Please stay safe out there. We will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.